good evening to everyone who's joining from India, and a very good morning to our speaker today. So, um, we are honored to have Steve Courtright, who is Professor of Management and Director of Flippin Leadership Institute at the Mays Business School at Texas A&M University, joining us for another deep dive, leadership deep dives for Ashang Desai Center for Leadership and Organizational Development. So Steve is currently Susan Flippen Endowed Chair at Texas A&M University and a Presidential Impact Fellow. Has done his BS in accounting from Brigham Young University, PhD from University of Iowa, and following an earlier stint at Texas A&M, he is basically back at Texas A&M, though in between he was at University of Iowa for about 5 years, where he founded the TP Leadership Collaborative. So his research focuses on leadership, teamwork, and work-family dynamics. And apart from top academic journals, he's already been featured by practitioner outlets like the Wall Street Journal, um, Forbes, and Harvard Business Review. So Steve was also named one of the world's best 40 under 40 MBA professors by Poets and Quants in 2022. Does a lot of training and consulting. So we're just happy to have him here, joining here for on a leadership deep dive. Steve, over to you.
Thank you so much, Amit, and thanks so much to those who are joining here. I'm just grateful for your time. I know that it's in the morning here in the United States, and it's in the evening right at dinner time in India, and I'm just grateful for those who have taken the time to be here. I'm excited to share this with you, and very grateful for the invitation to partner with the with the center to present some emerging research that I hope will be both interesting, eye-opening, impactful, and action-oriented. So I'm looking forward to presenting this paper that I'll be talking about today, which, as you see on the title here, is about the beauty bias and leader emergence. I'll go ahead and share my screen here as I get started on presenting this. I want to just first acknowledge that this research, as well as all my research, is definitely not done in isolation. I'm grateful for my co-authors who have been such great contributors in this. I have Gary Thurgood, who's at Utah State University, Weiyao Liao, who's at Chinese University, Hong Kong, also Jesse Wang, who's at Shenzhen University in China, as well as Tim Morgan, who's also here at Texas A&M University, and so very grateful again for their work on this paper. That's the joy of research, is working in a team. I want to just present to you, first of all, with the paper, just kind of the core problem that we're trying to solve here. And I always like framing core problems with good data. And so I just want to give you some findings here from a study that was done by a group called the Corporate Board Executive. And essentially what they do is they do some annual surveys on boards of directors, trying to take a temperature of essentially what are the things that are first and foremost on their minds. You might call the things that keep them up at night. And you'll see that 61% of the directors viewed succession management as their foremost talent concern. And about 63% of the directors agreed that succession was a greater priority now than even just 5 years ago. But about 70% of these directors reported moderate to severe leadership shortages. So in other words, boards of directors of organizations view leadership and filling leadership roles as fundamentally important, in fact, even more important, but they're also worried about the severe to moderate to severe leadership shortages. In other words, like about every other organization on earth, we are all in search for the leaders who take us to the next horizon, if you will. For those leaders who help bring both change and stability. For leaders who are helping to guide with vision and helping us to be able to get into the future, adapt to the future, and be able to succeed and compete in the future. We're definitely looking for leaders, and this is not only just employees, this is boards of directors as well. But just to couple these, let me give you a couple other points of data that present the problem sort of just that was driving our research here. And that is that this isn't just a corporate problem, meaning just a problem of boards of directors feeling like there's a lack of leadership, but it's actually a worldwide problem. In fact, the World Economic Forum put as their number 3 top global trends, or what you might even call global worries, as lack of leadership. Number 3 on that list. Just here in North America, where I'm at, 92% of people believe there's a leadership crisis in the world today. And perhaps an even more astounding statistic that points to this notion of leadership shortages is that more than half of people say they trust complete strangers more than their own boss. So as we look at each of these statistics, again, we point to a major problem. And the problem is this lack of leaders and this desire to look for leaders who are both, again, leading us into the future as well as helping us and meeting the individual needs that we have as well. It's a fundamental human need. Now, because of that, we are prone to highlight leaders who are actually impacting the world. So this is the most 2024 leaders who are impacting the world. And you'll see on here everything from athletes to political leaders to journalists to business leaders, religious leaders, those who are taking us, who are being profiled again as the top leaders in the world who are really impacting the world. We see this and we see these leaders sort of being profiled, and part of that is because we really desire to have leaders like this. But then that brings up a question, and the question is, how do you get leaders like this? In other words, how do you sort of make good decisions around who your leaders are? If that's such a critical need, how do you make good decisions around who your leaders are? Well, that led us to kind of understanding again the core problem of we need good leaders, we seek for good leaders. The question then that stems from that is, how are leaders identified? Well, to do that, let's talk about a few mechanics in this process for how leaders that we are seeking for are actually identified. The first thing to understand here is that leadership is a mutual influence process, meaning that leaders are both influencers and influenced by those that they lead. And so, in essence, for someone to become a leader, they have to be granted leadership. It's not a given. For example, you can be given a managerial position, but you may not be granted leadership. Leadership is a form of influence, and it has to be granted by others. And so those who are granting the leadership really kind of form judgments about whether a person is leader-like. And that doesn't mean this person has to be like one of the top 100 leaders in the world. It can just simply mean, does this person have what it takes to be a leader? And we form those judgments without even kind of recognizing it. Very subconsciously, we form judgments of others about whether a person sort of fits the mold, if you will, as a leader. And then those judgments feed into decisions about whether to grant that person some kind of a leadership role or some kind of influence over us or our organization. That's what's happening sort of in our heads and behind the scenes, if you will, as we are making evaluations of who we want to have be our leaders. But here's where it gets messy, is that we hope we make accurate judgments. We want to make accurate judgments so that those who we select as leaders actually are effective leaders. And so accurate judgments are obviously very key to effective leader identification and selection. But we're not always accurate. In fact, there's a lot of things that we make selections on with leaders that really have nothing to do with leader effectiveness. One of those that we're going to highlight here today primarily is beauty or physical attractiveness. But before we do that, I think we should probably at least say that there are certain things that do lead to better leadership. For example, there's certain traits and abilities that really matter for us to be good leaders and that we look for in leaders. Traits such as intelligence, or traits like conscientiousness. For example, are you task-oriented? Are you able to get jobs done? Or agreeableness. Can you connect with people? Are you approachable? Those are different traits and abilities that, according to past research, especially meta-analytic research or research that sort of is a summation of all these individual studies, those traits and abilities really matter. And if we select leaders based on intelligence or conscientiousness or agreeableness, we're going to probably hopefully have effective leaders come from that. There's also certain behaviors that lead to genuinely good behavior as well. The ability to communicate effectively, for example, the ability to be able to perceive a situation in your audience. These are behaviors or competencies. These actually matter. And to the extent that these are used in making decisions about who the leaders are, the more likely that our decisions about who becomes the leader actually are good decisions. But again, that's not what we always use to base our decisions on who becomes the leader. I'll give one quick example of this. This is now over 65 years ago in the United States, there was an election, a very famous election at the presidential level. It was between Richard Nixon, who had been serving as the vice president of the previous president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and John F. Kennedy, who is a senator from the state of Massachusetts. Now, what made this election really noteworthy was that in the United States, this was the first presidential election where debates were televised. And so previous to that, most debates, people would listen to them on the radio. Well, something really fascinating happened when they looked at data after these debates. What they found is that those who watched the debate on television overwhelmingly were supportive of John F. Kennedy, who is on the right. Overwhelmingly, those who listened to the debate on the radio were in favor of Richard Nixon, who was on the left. Furthermore, John F. Kennedy was overwhelmingly perceived as better looking than Richard Nixon. And so if you consider all things equal in terms of debate capability, what made the difference? It was that John F. Kennedy appeared young and good looking. And that's one of the reasons why he overwhelmingly won with televised voters. Now, it did not make things good also for Richard Nixon that previous to the debate, he had had a flu for 3 days, had been very, very ill. And so he looked pale on top of just not quite having the same level of looks as the legendary John F. Kennedy. And so even in this election, we see that looks actually influenced the election. It turns out since then, there's been a lot of different studies, and with quite good precision across the world, you can predict elections based on the relative looks of the candidates. Now, there's been a lot of different studies that have done that, and that's in political science when it comes to elections, that's in business, that's in education, that's in social psychology. And essentially, what you'll see with our study is that we wanted to take stock of the entire literature on that and do a quantitative review. But here's a few things that we knew prior to the quantitative review about attractiveness already just from the research literature that existed. First thing is that attractiveness is one of the first things that people notice in their social interactions. It's one of the first things we actually look for. And there's some reasons for that. If you go to the third bullet point on this slide, it's because we actually make implicit judgments of other people's traits and intentions based on their attractiveness. So we actually use attractiveness as an indicator of traits and of one's intentions, and therefore of of my propensity or my desire to trust that person. We know that so far from past research. Here's another interesting thing that we know from past research as well, and this is from past meta-analytic research, is that a lot of times when we talk about physical attractiveness, you'll say, but yeah, isn't beauty in the eye of the beholder though? It's actually not. So what we find from past research is there is actually widespread agreement both within and across cultures of what constitutes beauty. And that has everything to do, and there's a whole entire science on this I won't get into, between facial symmetry and all these different sort of, things that go into beauty. But suffice it to say that there's actually widespread agreement on who is beautiful, both within cultures as well as across cultures. Which means that that's why people agreed that John F. Kennedy was better looking than Richard Nixon, and why he was overwhelmingly more favorable with voters who saw him in person. Now, the other thing we know from past research is that even though beauty is very important in our social interactions, and even though we make judgments of others based on their beauty, what we do know is that attractiveness is not related to traits or behaviors that predict one's leader effectiveness. So for example, in one study, this is the Feingold 1992 study that's referenced on here, they looked at whether better looking people actually have better social skills. And in a meta-analysis, they found not really. Same thing with the Langlois et al. 2000 study. They said, are are physically attractive people more intelligent? And what they found is not really. But those two things are really important for effective leadership: social skills and intelligence. Attractiveness is not related to either of those. Yet, we tend to make judgments of people's social skills and of their intelligence based upon their attractiveness, which is precisely why we began our study by essentially the assumption that there's a certain bias toward beautiful people, that there is and we call this the beauty bias. Now, with that in mind and understanding what we know so far about the literature, here's what we really didn't know from the literature that we wanted to be able to pull out from the entire body of research that exists on beauty in relation to leader emergence. And these were our guiding questions. Question number one, if there is a beauty bias, how much does that affect leader emergence? It's one thing, for example, to say that, well, if I look good for a job interview for an entry-level position, that's going to give me a better opportunity to get that position. But does that hold if you're going for a managerial position? Does that hold if you're going for an executive position? Could it potentially be even stronger for that? To what degree does the beauty bias actually influence leaders' emergence? In other words, people's ascent into leadership roles. So we wanted to focus specifically on leader emergence and no other outcomes, just so we could see how much the beauty bias actually affects people's ascent into leadership. That was question number one. Now, question number two was this, is that there's some debate about who beauty benefits the most. So for example, there are those that would say, well, beauty actually primarily benefits men, and that actually beauty may hurt women, that being too attractive may actually hurt women in the process of becoming leaders, that they can be misperceived, if you will, by being too attractive. We wanted to figure out if that was the case. Now, you can do that in a primary study, meaning in a single study, but here's the problem, is that every single study has its limitation. We don't have limitless people to include in that study. From a statistical perspective, there's some complications in terms of really finding what we call statistical interactions in smaller samples. And so there's some statistical problems with figuring this out in one sample. So we wanted to take, again, dozens of studies that have looked at this question and have an overall picture of whether beauty bias primarily helps or hurts men or helps or hurts women. So that's another question that we addressed in this study. Now, the third question we want to address is, if the beauty bias does in fact influence leader emergence, why do we fall prey to it? What's the explanation behind it? Now, the way that we approached this question was to say, what other traits do we attach to beauty? So for example, if I see a good-looking person, what conclusions am I making about that person's traits? In particular, we looked at two different perceptions. We looked at whether the person is warm, and that means that they basically can connect with people or they have social skills. And number two, that they are competent. In other words, that they're intelligent or they're able to carry out the tasks they've been charged with. Is it that we fall prey to the beauty bias because we assume that beautiful people possess social skills and possess intelligence, and therefore we're more likely to grant them leadership, even though, as mentioned earlier, beauty really doesn't influence either of those actually? But we wanted to see if that's why we actually fall prey to the beauty bias, is those attachments we make to it, those trait-based attachments. Finally, we want to just see, is the beauty bias consistent across different contexts? So for example, is it more prevalent among people, for example, that are younger rather than more experienced? Is it more prevalent, for example, when we're selecting for executives who are the face of a company rather than for a lower level manager? Is it more prevalent in contexts where leadership is more informal and influence-based rather than more formal and position-based? These are the types of questions we just wanted to see how consistent is it, or are there certain contexts in which maybe beauty bias is minimized to some degree? These are the questions that really drove us in this and that stemmed from all these different problems that we're trying to solve with this. So with that in mind, let me pause for just a minute, having kind of laid out both the assumptions, laid out the questions that are guiding us. And let me just pause for a minute and just see if there are any questions that you might have up to this point before I start presenting to you how we actually answered these questions and what our findings were in this study. And if there's not, great. If there are, I want to give time for those before we dig further. Oh, I can't hear you there.
No questions, sir. You can move.
Okay, great. Sounds
Thank you.
good. I'll go ahead and move forward. Thank you. Yes. Okay, so with all those questions in mind, here's how we did this. So what we did is we went through the literature and we were able to uncover about 65 studies that had linked attractiveness to leader emergence. And here's again the benefits of doing it this way rather than relying on a single study. So first of all, when it comes to meta-analysis, we're not relying on a single sample to make conclusions, but that allows us to be very comprehensive, more than a single study could do, but also achieve precision in what is exactly happening here. And then it also again allows us to examine kind of just the robustness across different contexts, because different studies study in different contexts. There might be some in business, there might be some in government, there might be some in education. What does this look like across all of those contexts? Now, as we were going through the studies, I will say we had some initial predictions, as scientists do when we're doing studies. So for example, we did think there would be a positive relationship between physical attractiveness and leader emergence. But we also assumed, because of past research, that it would be stronger in magnitude for men. In other words, that the beauty bias would tend to help men more than it would help women. We also, as I mentioned earlier, kind of predicted that we thought that people would ascribe, or in other words, assign perceptions of warmth and competence to beautiful people. In other words, I think beautiful people are smart and good with people, so therefore I'm more likely to emerge them. So we did come in with these predictions here. We also came in with a few other predictions. We thought that maybe that people who had less work experience would be more prone to select leaders who are more beautiful. As we get further on in our career, maybe we gain more wisdom and experience, and we've had some good-looking leaders who weren't very good leaders, and maybe it's younger workers who are more prone or susceptible to this. We thought also that maybe the bias would be more prevalent when a leadership role was more influence-based or informal rather than a formal managerial position. We also thought the bias would be more likely to emerge when it is an executive leadership role. We also proposed that it would be more likely to emerge in more collectivist cultural contexts than in individualistic cultural contexts. All these studies came from across the world, so we were able to code for those in our studies and be able to see if there was any differences there. Anyway, these were our predictions going into it, but we're going to test those predictions and see if they were correct. How do we test them? Well, again, we did this meta-analysis that I've described already. We started with a really broad literature search. In fact, we examined over 1,000 potential studies that could be examining physical attractiveness and leader emergence. But then we had pretty stringent criteria for what got included to make sure that it had appropriate data, to make sure it was measuring the appropriate variables. And in the end, we ended up with a little over 5 dozen different studies with 65 different studies. I then had a research team that I mentioned earlier, and we had multiple raters who were coding each of these individual studies for what were the correlations between physical attractiveness and leader emergence. What was the context? What was the country they were done in? Is this a formal, informal leadership role? Is this an executive role? This is the grunt work, if you will, of doing meta-analyses, and we had a team of people who were doing these. And then what we did is essentially what this does is it corrects for different errors that can sometimes happen in individual studies, whether those errors come by how we measure variables or just by the fact that we have smaller sample sizes as well. So we did this work, and frankly, this work took a really long time. It took a long time to search. It took years for us to be able to uncover these studies. It took years for us to be able to code all these studies. But in the end, I think we have some really pretty fascinating results, some of which supported our initial predictions, and some of which were totally surprising to us. Let's start by reviewing what our major findings were. All right, so question number one, as I mentioned earlier, was there a positive relationship between physical attractiveness and leader emergence? We predicted, yeah, we think there would be. And yes, there was. The correlation is, the size of it is 0.36, which we would describe as a moderate size correlation, but starting to venture into what we would call a large correlation. So we might call this kind of a medium large correlation with this. Now, maybe that doesn't seem so surprising, but here's what's surprising. The effect of physical attractiveness on leader emergence is much larger than the effect of gender and leader emergence, of intelligence and leader emergence, and it's even slightly larger than the relationship between conscientiousness and leader emergence. In other words, as we've discovered in the literature, it's actually one of the strongest predictors of whether someone becomes a leader. It is a stronger predictor than gender. It is a stronger predictor than actual intelligence, and it is a slightly stronger predictor than one's level of trait conscientiousness, which again is sort of task dutifulness. It is a very strong correlation compared to others, which means it's actually quite a strong bias. We talk rightfully so about gender bias. We talk rightfully so about racial bias. We talk rightfully so about a number of different biases. The magnitude of the relationship between physical attractiveness and leader emergence was very surprising to us. So surprising that we could consider this as one of the strongest biases that exist when we select leaders. And yet, it's one of the biases we talk about the least. And again, perhaps surprising too, maybe not surprising, but unfortunately maybe surprising, is that it was a much better predictor than traits that actually lead to leader effectiveness, like intelligence and like conscientiousness. So we very much do select leaders based on beauty, very much so, stronger than we had anticipated. That's kind of finding number one with some surprise to it. Now, the next question we asked was, okay, so does this benefit men and women equally though, or is it universally beneficial or harmful? Again, there's been some studies that have suggested that maybe that looks can penalize women more. Here's what we found when we put all of these studies together with the power of a combined sample size of thousands, not just a couple of hundred. We actually did not find much difference between men and women in terms of whether their physical attractiveness hurts or helps them. In fact, the correlations, as you see here in the table, are nearly identical to one another. So in other words, men are equally helped or hurt by the beauty bias as women, is what we're finding. That was very surprising to us. We thought that it would be more men who benefited from it. We just did not find that to be the case when we put all of these studies together. It equally harms or helps men and women, this beauty bias. So that was one of our more surprising findings. Now, here's another finding that we had, and this goes with our predictions, but with a little bit of a twist to it. We also wanted to, again, find why does this bias exist in the first place? In other words, like, why is it that we fall prey to the beauty bias? Well, we wanted to investigate whether it's because we attach these perceptions of warmth and competence to good looks. In other words, I look at a good-looking person and I say, hey, they must be really good with people and they must be smart, and so therefore I'm going to promote them into a leadership role. Well, we did find support for both of those things. We do very much assume that people who are beautiful possess both warmth and competence. In other words, they're good with people and they're smart. But what we found is that primarily the beauty bias is explained by warmth more than competence. Now, this is an interesting thing, and there's a lot of different theories about why, and none of these we formally tested, but it could be, for example, that in media, good-looking people are pictured as both smart and not smart. We've seen movies, for example, where the good-looking person can be smart, and other movies where the good-looking person is not smart. We may therefore vary somewhat, a little bit more in our judgments in terms of whether good looks translate into competence. But with warmth, it's harder to find somebody who's not good with people, who's also good looking, or at least confident around people with that warmth. And so therefore, what we found is that the respective correlations between physical attractiveness and perceived warmth and perceived competence were quite different, even though they had relatively similar effects, this warmth and competence, on leader emergence. And so therefore, yes, what explains the beauty bias? Both perceptions of warmth and competence, but mostly warmth. Mostly, we perceive that good-looking people are better with people. And that's why we promote them into leadership roles. Yes, we also think they're smart. We primarily, however, think that they're better with people. But again, as we noted earlier, meta-analytic evidence from the past would suggest that's actually not the case. But good-looking people aren't actually better with people. We just think they are. Now, our final question was, how consistent is this? Is this bias more relevant for, or more prevalent, I should say, among those with less work experience, or maybe when it comes to more informal leadership roles, or maybe for executive roles, or maybe in certain cultures? And what we found, there's some differences, but really slight differences. So for example, there was a little bit more of the beauty bias that emerged among people, observers as we called them, who had less work experience. We classified these as college students versus full-time working adults, but the difference was very, very slight. And in both groups, college students and full-time working adults, we found that the beauty bias was very much prevalent and a very slight difference. Now, we did find more difference when the leadership role was more informal versus formal, and we have some theories about that I'll share here at the end because it leads to some interesting practical implications. But if, for example, if I'm asking someone to be an informal team lead on a project, you're not getting a new title or you're not climbing a ladder in the hierarchy, I might be more prone to select that person based on their looks than if I'm selecting someone for a formal management position in the middle, at the bottom, or at the top. Now, here's another finding I found surprising, though, in that regard. We thought for sure that people would be more likely to want beautiful people in an executive role. In other words, that we would find the beauty bias more prevalent when we're selecting for executive roles. After all, executives are often the face of an organization. Might we want that face to be attractive? We actually didn't find any difference. We actually value beauty just as much for entry-level positions as we do for executive roles. I found that to be fascinating. Now, here's a difference though. There may be some level of what we call statistically range restriction here. It could be that there's just fewer good-looking people who are vying, or fewer not so good-looking people vying for executive leadership roles. So there's maybe some caveats to that finding. But overall, we just did not find that the beauty bias was significantly more prevalent when we're selecting for executive roles than for other leadership roles. And finally, we did find a slight difference in cultures. We found that in collectivist cultures that the beauty bias was more prevalent when it came to selecting leaders than in individualistic cultures. There's a few reasons why we might be able to speculate on that, but in the end, the difference was ever so slight that really we didn't view that as that big of a deal. In other words, the beauty bias is pretty prevalent in collectivist and in individualistic cultures. And that just sort of led us to a bottom line kind of conclusion, which is that it's pretty consistent, that it's not depending, the beauty bias and its prevalence doesn't depend on position. It doesn't depend on work experience. It depends more on whether the leadership role is formal or informal. It doesn't really depend on culture. It's actually really consistent. And at no point in time did we find in any of these varying contexts that the beauty bias was not prevalent. In other words, we always found a significant positive and moderate to strong correlation between physical attractiveness and leader emergence in every context that we studied, even if there were slight to moderate differences. So beauty bias is pretty consistent across different contexts. Now we said, all right, this sort of is mind-blowing to us. Like, we didn't really expect this. So surely maybe there's just some methodological stuff happening here. In other words, there's just some things that are very peculiar to research that may be influencing it. Maybe it's that we have a lot of different laboratory studies, and maybe things don't play out the same in a controlled laboratory setting as they do when we're really making decisions. So we said, let's test that. We didn't find any difference. The beauty bias was just as prevalent in laboratory studies as it was in field studies and actual real world samples. We said, all right, well, maybe this is a function of how attractiveness is measured. So for example, in some studies, you clearly have a difference between attractiveness. You have what could be termed, a more ugly person with a very attractive person versus sort of an average looking person and a very attractive person. We said maybe those made a difference. It didn't. People were able to point out differences between attractiveness, even if the comparison was between average looks and really good looks, and that difference made a difference. Finally, we said, well, maybe this is more prevalent in the old days, before we were really talking about biases all that much. So we did it by publication date, and we said maybe in older studies, the beauty bias is more prevalent. Not so. We found it was just as prevalent in newly published studies as in older published studies. So again, bottom line conclusion here was the beauty bias is still remarkably consistent. So with all of that in mind, let me kind of just summarize these with two things. One is just sort of major conclusions we drew from this meta-analysis. And the second is let's talk about what the implications are for practicing managers. Major conclusions, number one, the beauty bias is very alive and well when we make leader selection and promotion decisions. And remember that it's actually stronger than most of the biases that we talk about more often. And unfortunately, it's stronger than actual valid predictors of leader emergence. It's also remarkably consistent across contexts and across gender. So in other words, men and women are equally helped or hurt by the beauty bias. And it doesn't matter if it's executive roles. It really doesn't matter if it's among people with more work experience or across different cultures. It's pretty darn consistent. And why is it so consistent? Well, because consistently what we do without recognizing it really is we associate beauty with being warm. In other words, with being able to connect with people and somewhat with being competent. And because we attach those judgments to attractiveness, that's why we select better looking people as leaders. Now, what are the implications of this? First implication is this, is that just knowing that the beauty bias is there, just awareness is a first step. This has been even very eye-opening for me as I staff teams, is to just be aware that this may be a particular bias that I have. And then we might ask, well, why does that bias matter? Because beauty doesn't relate to the traits or to the abilities that matter for leader effectiveness. I want to make the very best decisions possible. I want to select people whose traits and abilities essentially predict that they'll be effective leaders. I need to be looking elsewhere besides beauty to make that evaluation. But we also should be aware that the beauty bias is stronger than what we think it is. That it's not just that it is, among a host of different biases we have, it's actually a stronger bias than a lot of the biases we talked about before. And maybe the more discouraging part about it is that there's no government regulations about it. Now, I am not suggesting there should be. That's not my role. I am not a public policy analyst by any stretch. But what I am saying is that for some biases, there are certain regulations and government regulations around it, at least in certain countries. Here in the United States, for example, we have gender discrimination laws. We have age discrimination laws. Those are biases that play a role. We don't have physical attractiveness discrimination laws. Those don't exist. And I'm not suggesting they should. I'm just suggesting that this gives it more opportunity to influence our decisions because there's not government regulations around it. So in other words, we just need to be aware it's there, be aware it's strong, and be aware that there's no kind of regulatory guardrails around it. So a next question might be is, do we include this in any bias training that we might do as an organization? Racial, gender, age bias training is very prevalent in just compliance training. Do we include this? It may be worth it. It may be worth it to just say that this is an inclination that we have, is to have the beauty bias. But also in doing that, don't focus this training on just one single group. And I'll give an example of this. We've oftentimes thought that, well, this training needs to be given to men as they're selecting women for leadership positions, or this needs to be given to women as they select other women for leadership positions. It turns out that we're all pretty susceptible to it, and it turns out that all people are pretty susceptible victims of it. So if you're going to include this in any bias training, make it universal because it's pretty universally applicable. Now, the final thing is this, and this relates to one of our findings, which is that the beauty bias tends to be more prevalent when we're selecting leaders for informal leadership positions. In other words, one day I just sort of say, you know what, this doesn't come with a role, but I want you to take the lead on this part of the project or on this project in particular. Again, that doesn't come with a formal title change. That doesn't come with a formal, hierarchical position, but it's an informal role. And it turns out that the beauty bias is more prevalent in those. So, in other words, a level of formality seems to not eliminate, but seems to reduce to some extent the beauty bias. So as we're selecting leaders, the suggestion that I have from this study is to use more formalized, valid assessments for evaluating leadership potential. Now, that's a whole other discussion about competency models and about measuring competency models. Here at Texas A&M, I teach an entire 14-week course on that very subject. And so we won't dive into that. That's a subject for another day. But suffice it to say that there are many experts out there who can help with more formalized, valid assessments for evaluating leadership potential in a way that adds direct value to your strategy and to your plans for your organization. The more formality that's implemented in a selection process, turns out from our study, we would suggest that at least maybe not eliminate, but it can reduce to some extent the beauty bias. So we encourage that more formalized, more valid assessments for evaluating leadership potential rather than relying on what we might call the red herrings or what we might call the bias, the beauty bias. I hope that these findings are really helpful for you as we all seek to fill our leadership shortages, as we all seek to elevate people to be leaders who will actually help to really influence the world. Beware of the beauty bias as it influences those decisions. I want to thank you again for being here today and for listening to this presentation, and I'm looking forward to some Q&A now with any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Steve, for this amazing talk. Very clear, very very explanatory. So I think that's good for us to understand. So a few questions, and then we can have questions from the panel itself. But here, there is one person who's asking a question that do you think that people choose people who are more good looking or more beautiful because they think they'd be accepted by the teams more?
That's a really great question. And the answer to that I would say is yes. And I think here's where that plays into our findings is that part of the perceptions of one's warmth is how well we think that they'll sort of fit in with the group, how well they'll sort of do socially. That's almost kind of like our indicator for how good socially is this person. So absolutely. Sometimes we'll select them because we think they'll fit in and be more accepted by the group because they have those sort of social skills or the social presence that allows them to do that. So my answer is absolutely yes, based on our findings.
Okay. Thank you. There are two questions that have asked, and maybe some of them came earlier than you really finished, but be interesting for us to look at. And those are questions on the fact that, do you think race has an impact? Do you think, age has an impact? Cultural context has an impact on the perceptions of beauty and the biases
Yeah.
in it?
Yeah, real quick with the cultural context, we find a little bit. A little bit. Again, in collectivist cultures, there's a slight difference where in collectivist cultures, the beauty bias is more prevalent. In other words, there's a stronger correlation between physical attractiveness and leader emergence in collectivist cultures, but the difference is really slight. So it makes some difference, but not a super noteworthy difference. Now, age and race are a really interesting question because for us, we did this based on gender, and we found again that like men and women are both equally and hurt and helped by the beauty bias. We don't know a lot about race and gender, to be honest with you. One thing and we don't know this necessarily always in the broader physical attractiveness literature. One thing we do know is that, again, as I mentioned earlier, that we tend to have pretty broad agreement on who's good looking and who's not across cultures, and that can include race, for example. So we race and ethnicity. So we know that we form judgments of other people's looks, and that's not necessarily culturally specific. That we actually render judgments of good looks in people who are in different cultures and maybe different races and ethnicities than our own. But how does that influence our judgments of whether that actually translates into, leader effectiveness? We don't have that data, but I will say that based on everything we've done right now, we were just surprised by how remarkably consistent this bias was across all these different contexts, across gender. My prediction would be is that it's really consistent too across age and across race. That would be my prediction just based on the pattern of findings we have so far, but much more research needs to be uncovered on that. So it's a great question. I wish we had more data on it. That's my prediction based on what we have right now.
Yeah. So here's another question, and I think this is more on the fact that we also look at intersections, and so the question is, what does the literature talk about attractiveness? How attractiveness intersects with race, caste, socioeconomic class in shaping leadership outcomes?
It's a great question. And boy, I'll tell you what, this is a next area for future research is those intersections. We have really studied physical attractiveness in isolation, I think, in with these other traits. And I really like what you mentioned there in terms of this socioeconomic status. We know that makes a difference in terms of people's ascent into leadership positions. A guy named Sean Martin at University of Virginia has done some really great research on that, looking at how social class as adolescence really influences our future ascent into leadership roles. How does that intersect with physical attractiveness? And frankly, how does that intersect with any number of different traits and demographics? Boy, we need more research on that. We just don't have a lot. Now, again, my prediction would be only based on the pattern of findings that we have here right now, is that because of the context we studied, it's still remarkably consistent. I would guess that there's still some consistency with the beauty bias across socioeconomic status, again, across race. We don't know that for sure. If I'm doing future research on this, that would be my prediction going in. And then as a scientist, I'd love to be surprised when I'm wrong, when my
Right.
predictions are off, which happened with this study for sure. That's just my simple prediction right now, is that it's pretty consistent. But we need more research on the intersections, no doubt about it.
Right. Well, thank you. And I think this just, like every research, it only opens up more questions for us to look at. And that's always a good research.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Here's another question by Yasmin Soni. She says, could interventions such as blind evaluations, structured interviews, AI-based assessments reduce the impact of beauty bias?
I would 100% agree. In fact, we've learned, if there's anything we've learned from the research, is that pictures present biases. And so that absolutely. I actually have a wonderful friend and colleague who I was just interviewing yesterday for a separate thing, who does work on AI and staffing. Her name's Dr. Emily Campion at the University of Iowa. And that's exactly what her arguments and what her findings have been, is that AI actually especially when trained, when trained properly and trained in an iterative fashion, can actually result in more efficient, more effective, and more fair decisions. In other words, that it can help reduce some of this bias. Now, You have your own problems to solve with AI as well. It's not the the end of all troubles. There's definitely things to be able to do, but it can be of help. And I think especially with beauty bias, this may be a future a way to be able to minimize that.
Correct.
I think we need to have more future research on that. We didn't address that. Obviously, this is such an emerging topic that AI didn't come up necessarily in the studies that we had with 2004, but people like Emily and others who are studying this, I think this is a huge opportunity to be able to see if that can really, in fact, help reduce this bias, beauty bias, and other biases too.
Mm. Um, So another question is that if we conduct any assessment for high potential candidates and both candidates stand out equally, so what should we do to avoid beauty bias while selecting one out of those two?
Great question. So here's what I would say here. So um, there's a guy named Alan Church who's a really great industrial organizational psychologist. He's been the chief IO psychologist at Pepsi for years. Now, here's what's interesting about Pepsi is that I've had discussions with several different people at Pepsi over the years, and and this didn't necessarily come from the executives on top, not suggesting that at all, but there was this sort of like informal thing they used to call Pepsi Pretty. And so when they selected new employees, if there were equal on every part, they would select the more pretty one so that they could be Pepsi Pretty. I think that's really interesting. But what Alan's done in his work with that same company to help avoid that is he's talked about three different layers of selecting people. So number one is sort of foundational elements, and these would be things like intelligence, conscientiousness, sort of baseline skills. The next layer is what he calls growth dimensions. And in that, that's things like, does this person have a learning goal orientation? Or in other words, are they really seeking for learning through challenges? Are they open to feedback and criticism? Those are kind of growth dimensions. And then a third one is strategic dimensions. And that is this person good not just for the business now, but for the business needs in the future? And what I would suggest is that if you're really looking at all three of those dimensions, it's actually very difficult to find two candidates who are exactly qualified with each other. But what we tend to
Mm,
do is we look at the foundational elements and we assume they're more qualified without looking at the growth and then at the strategic. And so I would just say that, like, if we're doing that, I think the situation that is described is minimized to a certain degree. And then if it's not, and all say I'm wrong on this, and that you actually find essentially clones of one another, right? Who do you select, more good-looking person or not? You'll have to make that judgment based on what's needed for the business. So, for example, if you feel like that there is a strategic advantage to having the looks, okay, if it's strategic, I think that's different. But again, what we tend to do with the beauty bias is that we don't look at traits that are valid. We assume they have the traits that are needed because of their looks, and then we make poor decisions. So
mm.
I hope that helps to address that question, but it's a
No,
great.
that's a really smart answer, and I think what I'm also hearing you say is that in a way, if we are saying two people are equal, maybe we haven't done enough work to really
Yes,
differentiate them on things that possibly matter for the business or for the
It's
role
a-
that we're looking at. Yeah.
that's a great way to describe it. And again, those three buckets hopefully help. What are the foundational? What are the growth? What are the strategic capabilities?
Right.
Has,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. I really wonder, and this isn't a question, but it's just come to my mind that, when, with these contexts where we have Zoom, we have all these places where people can actually touch up how they look before they come on
Right.
to online. And I mean, I think it's the right strategy for people to do if they are trying to impress the other person. And I think
Yes.
we do all interpersonally try to impress other people. But then is it only going to exacerbate the bias playing in.
Yeah.
I might like a speaker better, not because they're making more sense, but I might just like them better because they just look better.
That's such a great question and an insight in that. It's so fascinating. I mean, I could press a button right here and it touches up my appearance a little bit more, and heaven knows I need it sometimes, And I think as a, and we can do that. We can also create really polished AI images of ourselves. Just this morning, by the way, I just had this fun little activity with Chat GPT, and I won't show you the picture, but it's exactly what you're saying. And I was thinking about this presentation early this morning when I woke up, and I said, and I just asked ChatGPT, what do I look like? Based on what you know about me right now, what do I look like? And it generated this image. I'm like, that's a very good looking man. I am not that good looking. And I said, well, here's my actual picture. And then it merged it together. And the picture it gave me, I was like, that's also a very much better looking version than me, right? So you can actually use AI even to sort of spruce yourself up. Does that enhance the beauty bias? And I would say, absolutely. What it does is it acknowledges that this is a human decision-making heuristic. And so that kind of gets me to one other thing too that might bear mentioning, is that I've framed this as a bias that we need to avoid when we're making leadership decisions. Now, one time I had a student who said, yeah, but if that exists and you really have a tough time minimizing it, shouldn't we take advantage of it? And I was like, that's a great question, right? And so this is the flip side of that coin. As I talk to my students about it, I was like, yes, and this is why go well groomed to your interviews. This is
Yeah.
why you can, because now the flip side is you understand what human nature is, and you understand that you may be passed over for a job even though you're perfectly qualified for it because you didn't get ready enough. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
understanding this, yes, you can use this to your advantage, if you will. And so this is, you hit on something there, which is, yes, it exists. Yes, we should minimize it to make better decisions. Yes, we would probably be wise if we also recognized it in our own interactions with people, and so that we don't get passed up when we're well qualified for a job.
Right. Right. Thank you.
Great question. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the panel?
Oh, thank you, Steve, for that wonderful conversation, and you're opening up a lot more questions. So one of the
Which
things,
is what research does.
yes,
That's right on it. Yeah.
and I just so one thing I'm noticing is a lot of these companies that are selling hiring solutions are also asking for video interviews, a small
Mhm.
stuff, and that brings into this question that entire thing seems even more biased, because now with AI and you're prepped for an interview, you can do a much, much better job than you actually are, you know.
Yes, I agree with you. Isn't this a fascinating thing where when we have with the new age, right, of video interviews and things like that, like again, you can use that to your advantage, but as an organization, does that actually enhance the bias that we've been talking about so far?
Sure.
And so, my suggestion for that is absolutely these video interviews can do that. That's a great example of that, Amit, in terms of where this can be heightened. And so, as an organization, what we're always striving to do is get multiple data points. So, the video might be one data point, but as much data, and obviously we don't have limitless data. We have a scarcity of data, but to the degree that we can collect other data that either confirms or debunks what we're talking about, great. But also, I think when we go into those video interviews, recognizing that this is a bias, and so therefore we're on the hunt for additional, more valid information, I think is really useful. So I'm not suggesting we don't do those video interviews. I am suggesting that we be watching out even more for the beauty bias and collect other information that's going to be useful to make good, accurate judgments.
It's lovely to that you volunteered your time and shared your research. I think it's definitely something that has got all of us thinking about what and what not, and maybe more research to look at. So thank you, you and your
My
team, for doing
pleasure.
this wonderful research,
Thank
and
you
then
for
you
having
agreeing to
me.
present it. Yes, thank you, and thank you, audience, for being here. Sorry, we don't know your names and so on and so forth at this point of time. But thank you, and I hope you keep joining in for other conversations that we organize once in a while. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all
Thank
so
you.
much. Yeah, appreciate it. This was wonderful. It was fun and a great way to start the morning. So for me, and hopefully then it's a great way for you to end the day. So
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
we'll
So
take
thank you.